Prime Minister, it's important we look at the facts.
Why? Why?
Douglas Ross is sounding pretty scared.
I believe in independence. And he clapped like a seal.
Hello and welcome to another Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, the political editor of the Daily Record. Joining me this week are two esteemed colleagues, John Ferguson, who's the political editor of the Sunday Mail, and Anna Burnside, who's the chief writer of the Daily Record. So we're going to go straight to the very sad news which broke this afternoon about the death of former Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling. I don't think anyone really saw that coming, and it was very sad indeed. Alistair Darling was a remarkable figure. I think I'm right in saying that he served in the last Labour government from the first day to the last. So I think he was Chief Secretary to the Treasury under Tony Blair, and then in the final days of Gordon Brown's premiership, he was, of course, his Chancellor. So that was quite a record. And then, of course, he led the Better Together campaign during the independence referendum. And I think many folk on the no side would say his role in that was absolutely critical. So, Anna, just starting with you, people, when folk die, people often make over-the-top tributes, but there's no doubt about it. Alistair Darling was a Labour giant, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a huge figure, a really, really solid, quite old school Labour politician. So I'm very sad about this. I knew him quite well in my first proper job in journalism, which was as editor of the Gorgie Rye Gazette in the 1980s. So at that time, he was the MP for Edinburgh Central. And the Gorgie Rye Gazette was a community newspaper. It was funded partly by Lothian Regional Council, then Labour controlled. And obviously we had a lot to do. You know, it was a community newspaper. We had a lot to do with our councillors and MPs. So that's how I got to know Alistair, and I just found him a really solid, decent guy to deal with, generous. I a lot of respect for him as a politician. I met him again. I remember bumping into him again years later, just walking through Edinburgh, and I you know, I was by this time, you know, working in another paper slightly higher up, but I hadn't, you know, reached the extent of, you know, being in government, which he had. So we'd been a bit of a divergence in our careers. And I was like, oh, hi, you know, how are you going? How are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm just off to visit some schools. And he just said, oh, yeah, well, you know, you get really stuck in an office being a politician. And whenever I can, I like to just go out and, like, you know, meet people and kind of see what's happening. And I have to say, I was just very impressed by that. And, you know, think it's a model that other politicians would do well to follow.
I think that's a very apt anecdote, Anna, because he was a councillor in Edinburgh at the early part of his career. You know, quite a left-wing councillor, and then he was elected to Westminster, I think, in '87, and so held all those roles in government at different levels, and then chaired Better Together. He was a public servant to his fingertips, wasn't he?
He absolutely was, and he was just generous. He had a generosity with his time. You know, I remember going to parties at he was married to Maggie Vaughan, a journalist at the Glasgow Herald, as it was at the time. And I remember going to parties in their lovely house in Stockbridge and just being slightly slack-jawed at, like, oh, this is how kind of cool grown-ups live. You know, they had private eye cartoons on the wall, and But it's that generosity that I remember. You know, he didn't have to have a party and invite the editor of the Gorgie Rye Gazette. You know, that was above and beyond. And I think that also just speaks very well of him.
John, he was Chancellor during one of the most tumultuous periods of recent British history. By that, I mean the financial crash, which threatened to take down the British economy and pretty much every other economy in the world. How do you think he'll be remembered in terms of how he dealt with that crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it will remain controversial, won't it, that he was the Chancellor who took the decision to bail out the banks with billions and billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. And you know, so there's differing opinions on whether that was the right thing to do. It certainly does seem that those banks would have collapsed at the time if he hadn't taken that action, but who knows how everything would have played out. But I mean, I think also you would mention that he led the Better Together campaign, which obviously was also a deeply divisive period in Scottish politics. And I guess that what's testament to his character is that you'll not really find anyone who will have a bad word to say about Alistair Darling, despite the fact he was, you know, had this very controversial job in government and took controversial decisions, and also led a very controversial political campaign around the referendum. There's nobody really, I think, that you would find who would have much of a bad word to say about Alistair Darling, despite the fact that he was involved in such controversial things. I think that's testament to his character. He's just clearly a very nice and considerate man who was genuine and genuinely wanted to make Scotland and Britain a better place.
And looking back, John, I mean, 2020 hindsight's an easy thing, but he was the sort of perfect candidate for the Better Together role, wasn't he? You know, he was a Labour figure, and he was kind of trusted across the political aisle in terms of the sort of the unionist perspective. You know, he was a one-time chancellor. He was noted for his integrity. It was much better that he led the campaign than, say a Conservative from the David Cameron government. Yeah,
absolutely. It was a sort of I think he pitched it just about right, didn't he? It was a very kind of softly approach that he took. He didn't, think that if you had Gordon Brown's clunking fist, that might not have gone down quite so well with the public, because I think they chose Alistair and he was the perfect person for that job, because he could just, very nicely explain, and he wasn't too confrontational in the way that he went about things. I think that was probably about right.
I mean, don't you think that? I was just going to add that. I mean, that his demolition of Alex Salmond over the currency question in that first TV debate, I thought was a pivotal moment in the referendum campaign, and that really set the tone and made that. I mean, for me, the issue that always had the Yes campaign on the back foot, and he had the perfect authority to do that. Salmond has, Salmond has a lot of personality and all that things, but Alistair Darling has been Chancellor, and that's always going to trump that. And from that point of view, I thought that was really, really well played, and that he played that perfectly.
I think you're right, Anna. That was probably the highlight of his referendum. That was
his moment, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, all the expectation was that Salmond was going to win because he was the showman. But it didn't work out that way, and Alistair Darling really did land some blows on the currency question, particularly. It's funny because I spoke to someone who worked with him during the Better Together campaign about 5 minutes ago, and he was saying that after that debate, I think Alistair Darling went back to Better Together HQ, or maybe backstage, and all the supporters were sort of whooping and cheering, and he was kind of embarrassed by that. That just wasn't.
Yeah, really that's not his style. That wasn't really his style, was it? He's not he's not the kind of politician that you imagine a big foam finger would play any part in his, scenario.
Yeah, he was quite not stern, but he was a modest guy. I mean, he was very clever.
I think that's partly what I mean about it being quite old school. He is. I mean, as Brown was, he's of that generation, a very different generation, a very unflashy, unflamboyant, which was why it was so interesting to see him up against Salmond, and how those two, kind of slightly curdling personalities squared off against each other. I mean, that was just a fascinating thing to observe. And I mean, we don't often frame it like this, but Alistair Darling and the Better Together campaign won. Mm-hmm. So, that has to be, whatever your personal feelings about it, I mean, they won that campaign, And, that has to be something that's on his record.
And I think Alistair was 70 when he died. That's still pretty young.
Not much of an age at all, is it?
He's the latest in a long line of Scottish politicians who died too young. Donald Dewar, John Smith, Robin Cook, now Alistair Darling. These people should have lived for a lot longer than they did. But we often look at some of the rotten politicians we've had, but we've had some pretty excellent ones as well. And you'd have to say that Alistair Darling was among them.
Absolutely.
Just moving on then to the Michael Matheson story, John. The story that never dies. It's like Groundhog Day. I think we said last week, we spoke about how the corporate body in the Parliament had launched an investigation into the data roaming scandal. What we had this week was a poll showing that a majority of Scots want Michael Matheson to quit. It's just not going away, is it? We haven't had a great revelation in this story for quite some time, but it's just the story that doesn't die.
Yeah, I think the problem for Michael is that even if you believe his version of events, he still clearly was told a lie when he said when he gave an interview and said that there had been he wasn't aware of any personal use of his iPad. His own statements later seem to completely contradict that, and frankly, his overall explanation isn't particularly plausible. So I think that the longer it rumbles on, the more damage it's doing to the Scottish government in general. And you just feel like if Humza Yousaf had been smart about this, he should have said to him, "You need to resign," and possibly he could have come back into the government and say 6 months, a year. But by allowing him to stay and to just sort of try and brass it out, I think it's doing untold damage to everyone involved.
That's it, John, because we know from the Tory government down south that a resignation these days isn't really the end. It's just
sadly not.
No, it's like a staging poster. Come back within 18 months. If he just put his hands up and said, "Look, I messed this up. I'm going," I would imagine he'd be back in cabinet by the end of this term.
Yeah, exactly. He could have been back fairly quickly, but it kind of feels like he's taking everybody for a fool now, doesn't it? He's, by just belligerently saying, "I'm not leaving."
Yeah, stop following me.
Yes.
Stop asking me questions. I just think it's spectacular the way that he has misread the room on this, because anyone who has teenage children has been in a situation similar to this, probably not 11 grand's worth, but we have all been there. Our children have all bought something on an online game or done some daft thing of this nature and landed their parents with some horrendous spill. And had he I really believe that if he had fessed up to this as soon as possible, people would have been sympathetic and he'd have had to pay it off and do whatever. But I think people would have basically been sympathetic to him because we have all been there and we know how horrendous it is. And he has just done the classic thing of making the cover up worse than the crime. And it's the lying that is really, really unattractive and a bad look. And why
I mentioned the corporate body are doing this investigation into Michael Matheson. Do you think that's a critical finding in this investigation?
We need a knockout punch, don't we? I mean, they've made it clear that their strategy is just to hang on and try and, as John very eloquently said, brass it out and tell journalists to stop following him. So it needs something else to happen. Something has to move. So yes, it could be the corporate body could deliver the knockout punch. It's got to be something else has got to happen. Otherwise, I mean, they're going for the kind of General Winter school of politics, aren't they? They're just saying, right, just tough it out, say nothing. It'll soon be the holidays, it'll go away. Everyone will kind of forget about it. Something else will happen, circumstances will help us out here. So it needs to have something needs to move.
What's your
Kind of
prediction,
feels like
John?
in
Do
the
you think
past.
he'll top it out?
I couldn't
Kind
hear
of
either
feels
of
like
those.
in the past, the knockout blow would have already come, wouldn't it?
You would think so.
You know, Henry McLeish and Wendy Alexander
Well,
and
exactly.
all of these figures in the past resigned for an awful lot less.
Masses less. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about it, isn't it? It shows how our political culture has changed, and whether that's like the whole Johnson farrago, but you know, just generally what people are prepared to accept has just, the goalposts on that have just moved into the far horizon, haven't they? And what we now consider unacceptable or as acceptable behaviour has completely changed.
Yeah, I blame Trump for that. It's like the Trumpification of politics.
Yeah,
the
very
things that
Trumpy.
he did, you know, you'd think just out of a sense of shame that he would quit, but it seems to have spread all over the world that, you know.
And it makes Humza Yousaf look very, very weak. It really does. It makes him look like a bit of an idiot, standing by this. I mean, you know, middle performing minister. I don't think anyone could look at the NHS and say the guy was playing a blinder, really, could they? So standing by this middle performing minister who's just making him look bad on a daily basis.
The third story we're going to look at, completely different issue, is abortion clinic buffer zones. Now, there is a proposal by the Green MSP Gillian Mackay to create buffer zones, which is a response to anti-abortion protesters outside clinics, and it would mean that they would not be able to harass women within a sort of certain, I think it's maybe 200 meters from an abortion clinic.
I think that's correct.
Yes. So this is going through Holyrood just now, and it's raised questions about how do you define harassment, what would be included in the buffer zone. And the former SNP Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, gave an interview to a Christian media outlet at the weekend, in which she said that she didn't think that silent prayer outside abortion clinics should be within the ambit of the legislation. I'll just quote what she said. She said, "I think there are some really important points here. Firstly, I do not think that you can ban prayer. So I think that silent prayer is essential, and that is an important freedom to uphold." Now, and I think that you wrote about this in your column.
Oh, yes.
What's your response to Kate Forbes's defence of silent prayer?
Well, frankly, I think it's a piece of nonsense, because it's very disingenuous, because yes, people are welcome to pray silently anywhere they like, for instance, in their home or in church or wherever they happen to be. What they do not need to do is go and very ostentatiously do it with banners outside a healthcare facility where women are going for a termination of a pregnancy. There's no need for that. They can pray anywhere they like. The only reason that they are choosing to pray in that particular spot with that particular banner is to harass and intimidate women who are accessing healthcare. And I think we have to be very, very clear about that. Abortion is healthcare. It's one of the World Health Organization's designated pieces of essential healthcare that should be available to everybody. And you should be able to access healthcare without having a religious zealot praying, or in some cases actually reciting Bible verses to you when you are quite possibly in a very vulnerable and difficult situation. You know, if you look at the reasons that women would be terminating a pregnancy, you know, they range from contraception failure to being having been raped, having been a victim of incest, having a really serious medical condition that the pregnancy might be making worse, to possibly having taken drugs for a serious medical condition before you knew you were pregnant. There's a whole gamut of ghastly scenarios where you may then be in a situation of having to terminate a pregnancy, and which is a very difficult and horrible thing for anyone to have to do. And what you do not need is anyone silently praying, while you're going to the appointment. So I really think it's very invidious, and it's kind of just using prayer. It's using prayer as a kind of cloak to hide this nasty campaigning behind, I think.
Anna, the thing that strikes me about it is that if there are 10 people outside an abortion clinic silently praying, you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of that? And
well, the purpose of it is to make these women feel bad, to make them feel shame or embarrassment, or possibly, I mean, I would imagine they would say that they would like to be changing their minds about accessing healthcare. Well, you don't silently pray outside a clinic to try and get people to change their mind about having their appendix removed or their knee replaced or whatever other, their teeth cleaned, whatever other medical procedure they might be going to do. Obviously abortion is such an emotive issue that people do behave in that way. And, we have people like Kate Forbes saying it's a legitimate way to behave, which is why I think the buffer zone legislation is unfortunately needed. And, it's to Gillian Mackay's credit that she's got this bill to the stage it's at, and it's at the consultation stage at the moment. And hopefully she can get it over the line.
John, Kate Forbes clearly has her supporters in the SNP. I mean, I think she won 48% of the vote in the leadership battle against Humza Yousaf. But do you believe, like I do, that her views on things like equal marriage, which she said that she would have voted against had she been an MSP at the time, her anti-abortion stance, her scepticism of parts of the buffer zone plan, is this still her Achilles heel?
Yeah, I think it is. I thought it was an extraordinary thing for her to have said that, that this silent prayer thing is just clearly, like Anna's just explained, this is about intimidation and shaming women when they're in a very vulnerable position. And it just seems crazy that you wouldn't want to, that you would essentially be condoning that kind of behaviour. And I think what it shows is that Kate Forbes has these very strong religious beliefs that people think, well, surely she's going to be able to put those to one side if she was to potentially become the First Minister one day. But I think you seem to see time and time again that probably that wouldn't happen, and that these really are a huge part of who she is as a person, and that it's not something that she can kind of leave at the door when she goes to work. So I think it just shows that these kind of issues are going to come up time and time again. If she decides to challenge for the leadership of the SNP at some point.
Yeah, let's imagine there's a spring general election and the SNP have a terrible election. They lose a couple of dozen seats. There's huge pressure on Humza. And Kate does decide to stand against Humza Yousaf. Anna, do you think she would stand a chance?
Well, she has got a very clear, faction of support who don't seem to mind her socially conservative views. But I do think it would be unpalatable to a lot of people in the party. Obviously, it would spell the end of the Green coalition. I mean, that again, to her support base is a plus point. So I think it's probably a deal breaker, but I think if there was such an election again, I think it would be quite unpleasant and possibly divisive and even counterproductive.
I'm surprised that she's not trying to reassure people. If she's still got leadership ambitions, that she's not trying to reassure people more on things like equal marriage and abortion. But she does seem to be doubling down and expressing her dissatisfaction with elements of what's being proposed.
While not ruling out standing again. So yes, I mean, clearly that seems to be her strategy. She sees no reason why she shouldn't be absolutely clear about what she stands for. So, I mean, in some ways you have to say, well, fine, you're being very clear about it. And I suppose, if she wasn't being clear about it, we would be having the counter conversation, wouldn't we? Saying, oh yes, but, the way she's approached it, she's not leaving any room for oh yes, buts, is she? She's making it absolutely clear where she stands. So I suppose in some ways, well, that is helpful. That is helpful because if these are deal-breaking issues, then we're absolutely clear that that for you that deal is broken.
I think that you do have a little bit of sympathy for him from the point of view that it's the one. I don't think anyone will ever interview Kate Forbes without asking her a question around abortion or same-sex marriage or something like that. Nobody's asked her about creationism yet, but I'm sure at some point someone will. That as much as I don't think she particularly wants to answer questions about these things, but she's always going to be asked them, and it does appear that she's not going to compromise on what she believes. In a way, it's a shame because she's clearly a very competent politician who would have a lot to offer. And I was suggesting to me that if Humza was clever, what he would do is sack Matheson and give Kate Forbes, or certainly offer Kate Forbes the job as health secretary, and it would be a way of neutralising that threat from her as well. I mean,
I think it was a mistake for him not to offer. I think it was a mistake for him not to offer her a job. I mean, they're not, as the Matheson debacle shows, they're not exactly over-endowed with sparkling talent, are they? So I think that, that was a huge mistake, actually, for him, I think, not to bring her into the tent.
Although, I mean, I can see the logic to maybe replacing Matheson with Forbes, but would that not put her in charge of the buffer zone legislation, or at least
possibly, yes.
Portfolio minister? So that might be quite a tough one to square off with the Greens, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think the reason that he didn't bring her that she's not in the cabinet is hugely to do with the Greens. I think that those two are, to use an unfortunate possibly analogy in this case, I think they are oil and water, and they ain't going to mix, are they?
Very briefly, speaking of oil, First Minister is in Dubai for COP. John, inevitably you get a bit of moaning about why is he there? This is a UK government matter, but I'm pretty relaxed about it. He's Scotland's First Minister. He's representing Scottish interests. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, if you want to criticise his decision to go, you talk about the amount of carbon that he's going to have burned through travelling over there, and there is also question marks in general over whether the COP conference isn't just one giant greenwashing opportunity. This year it's being led by the Sultan Al Jaber, who is actually the head of the UAE's biggest oil company, the biggest oil company in the world, and there's been stories about how they're doing oil deals behind the scenes at the conference. So there are question marks over the whole idea of having a COP conference, but I don't suppose Humza Yousaf's presence there is doing any harm, and I think we do know that he is a genuine believer in trying to tackle the climate the climate crisis. So I don't think it's a bad thing for him to have gone.
And John's right, isn't he? It's about what's achieved at COP, what the outcomes are, rather than Humza Yousaf being there or not.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you put this on the list for today, because actually I'd forgotten he was there, and I got a bit of a surprise when it was Shona Robinson at First Minister's Questions. I was like, oh, why is she there? And then I remembered, oh yeah, right, okay, he's away at the COP conference. Because foreign policy is a reserved issue, Scottish First Ministers don't have many opportunities for foreign trips, jollies, exposure, however you want to frame it. So I don't think you can really blame him for wanting to take this opportunity, because it's not, to be on a world stage isn't an opportunity that he gets very often. I hate my doots that him being there will make a bit of difference to anything. I mean, obviously, what matters is them, making some progress. Whether or not Humza getting his Tuppence in will further that aim, not so sure about that.
All right, let's wrap it up. Good week, bad week. Let's start with you, Anna.
Okay, good week. I think Patrick Harvey, the Greens energy person in the Scottish Government Cabinet, has actually had a good week. So it might not initially sound like that. The plan to phase out gas boilers has been pushed back by 3 years, but actually I think this has been well handled. There's been a consultation on this, and it actually sounds as if people have actually listened to the consultation, which with many consultations you don't get the impression that they make a blind bit of difference. This actually does seem to have made a difference. And I think the new scheme, they've recognised that some of the things they were asking for are unrealistic, or the timescale was unrealistic. So they've reframed a lot of that. So actually, I think that has been well handled, and it's an important but quite boring thing that has to be done. And I think actually it's been well handled. So not often you can say that. So I think that's a good week for Patrick Harvey, and let's hope that we can make some more progress on that. Bad week, Stephen Flynn, SNP leader in Westminster, in his gilet. This is such a bad look. I wish everybody wouldn't wear these things. I would just like to point out that the MP's salary is £86,500 a year. He works in central London. He has within walking distance many nice shops where you could buy a jumper, a nice merino wool jumper in a neutral colour that would look extremely smart and keep him cosy. And he can not wear the gilet or keep it for weekends at home when he's gardening, which is the only time it's excusable to wear one.
He looks like a turtle with that sort of...
A terrible look. It's not a good look. Not a good look at all.
Steve, if you're listening, we appreciate the call and we go out for the Daily Record, but
ditch the gilet.
Ditch that jacket, definitely. John, over to you. Good week, bad week?
So I've gone for Humza Yousaf as having had a good week. There was a STV poll that showed that appeared to show that the SNP are actually doing not too badly with voters. It showed that the SNP are actually ahead of Labour in, I think it was Westminster voting intention, and also really interestingly showed that support for independence at 54%. So that's, it does feel like it's a bit against the grain of amongst all of these scandals, that support for independence appears to be increasing under his leadership of the SNP and Scottish Government. I think it's been a bad week for Michael Matheson, and the only way that he has really of ending this is to just accept that the game's up and resign his post.
Great, excellent. Well, thanks for that. That concludes another Planet Holyrood. God knows what we're going to be talking about next week. Who knows? Maybe Michael Matheson yet again for what feels like the 6th week in a row. So thanks to Anna and to John for their expert analysis and commentary, and I hope that you tune in next week as well.
It's important we look at the facts.
Why?
Douglas Ross is sounding pretty scared.
I believe in independence. And he clapped like a seal.